Welcome, everyone. This is the first of the Center for Victim Research's webinars in a long time, and the first one that we are using Teams. So please bear with us if we have a couple of technological headaches. I also want to let you know that this webinar is supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime, but all of the thoughts, all of the slides are our own and do not necessarily reflect any opinions of the Department of Justice. So just a quick second about the Center for Victim Research. The center aims to improve the response to victims and survivors of crime through helping folks collect and use victim data, increasing access to research evidence, supporting the translation and dissemination of evidence, and improving opportunities for researchers and practitioners to work together. And today's presentation does a couple of those things. So you'll note among our presenters, we have both researchers and practitioners, and they are sharing with you the results of an interesting recent study. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to them and they will introduce themselves. So I'm going to stop sharing so they can share their slides.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan, and thanks everyone for being here today. We're so excited to share our study with you. Give me just 1 second, and hopefully I will be able to do that. All right. So we will very briefly give some introductions. I will share a little bit of background on the study, as well as, my colleague Claudia will as well, before diving into what's really important is the key findings and some implications for practice before allowing some time to hear from you all. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. But before that, very quickly, here are who you will hear from today. We have 3 of the research team. So myself and my colleague Marina from RTI International co-led this study with great support from our colleague Claudia, also from Urban. And we're joined by one of our practitioner partners, Orchid, who's from the Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco. I believe there were some bios when you registered for this, so I don't want to take too much of our time by giving our detailed background, but yeah, we're excited for you to be able to hear from both those of us on the research team as well as one of our practitioner partners who was so instrumental in making this study a success. All right, so with that, so this study was a 2.5-year-long multi-site mixed method study that focused on the perceptions of justice, safety, accountability, and healing held primarily by diverse survivors of domestic violence. We really were hoping to understand how perceptions of justice is understood and experienced by survivors who aren't traditionally included in research studies and whose voices aren't usually included in conversations about policy and program development. We also wanted to understand to what extent there's alignment between survivors and practitioners around these perceptions of justice. As I mentioned, this study was led by the Urban Institute in partnership with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, which is where Marina was until recently, and it was funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. So much like Susan already shared, this study was funded by them, but the findings and what we're sharing today is our own. And then this study was supported by a what we call a practitioner consortium of experts. You'll hear from Orchid today from Asian Women's Shelter in California, but we also had several other partners from around the country who again were instrumental in making this study happen. So that includes Mending the Sacred Hoop in Minnesota, Hugh Lane Wellness Foundation in Pennsylvania, and the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. All right, so I am going to go ahead and pause there and pass it over to Claudia to give a little bit more background on the methodology and how we did this, who some of our participants were, before diving into the findings.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mallory. So for this project, our methodology focused on 4 key areas. And so that included conducting interviews with survivors from diverse backgrounds and geographies, and interviews with practitioners who work with a range of experience, who have a range of experience working with survivors and or the abusive partners. We also administered a short web-based survey to survivors and practitioners who had participated in our interviews. And finally, in January, we facilitated a roundtable of our survivor and practitioner stakeholders in order to develop our guiding principles for practice, which was just recently released. And so hopefully you all will have a chance to read that soon. And in the interviews and surveys, we covered topics such as definitions of justice and safety, accountability, preferences and needs, and perceptions of the legal system and alternative justice responses. Next slide, please. So throughout this project, we engaged our practitioner partners as we developed interview protocols and survey instruments, and as well as in the recruitment of survivors and other practitioners through trusted avenues in order to participate in this study. And the research team also engaged in culturally specific trauma-informed training before conducting interviews. And throughout this entire process of data collection, we were really keeping accessibility in mind. And so we had trained interpreters available when needed for interviews, and all survivors and practitioners had the option for in-person or virtual interviews, especially because this was around the country. And so we wanted to make sure that people were able to access it in whatever ways they needed. So yeah, I guess we can pass it to Orchid, and if there's anything that you would like to add about how we tried to make the study as trauma-informed as possible for survivors, or if there's anything that you learned from the research process as it relates to being responsive to survivors.
Thank you. I would just add 2 points. First, on that third point, the culturally specific trauma-focused training. I just, I hadn't been in a group before where there just was time given for this, so that each of the practitioners who were part of the team could give a short overview of what the context is for working with the clients that, we were each recruiting or connected to and bringing into the project. So I think just having that specificity instead of just a general culture and trauma training made it stronger, made the, I hope, information stronger and more usable and pragmatic for the people leading the study. Second thing is availability of trained interpreters. I think one of the strengths that we had was the opportunity to give clients or survivors the option to use the same interpreter they have worked with before, if that's at all possible, just so that we're not bringing in yet another person that they don't know, where they have to share what happened with someone from their language community. So if there were the possibility that we could just keep it as contained to people who already know, with the exception of the actual researcher, we did that, and I think that's strong.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding those points. I think, yeah, it's certainly so important and was valuable for the research team to have that very specific training. And yeah, just amazing that, you were able to really keep survivors in a tight community that they felt trusted in. Okay. So we can go to the next slide, where we'll briefly run through the demographics of the interview participants. And so as you can see here, we had 54 survivors and 42 practitioners who participated, and they come from a wide range of geographic regions, and also the practitioners come from a variety of backgrounds working with survivors and partners throughout, in their time. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so we also had a survey, again, that was administered to people who had participated in interviews. And so here, out of the 54 survivors, we had 37 who completed the survey. And out of the 42 practitioners, we had 16. And so this means that the response rate was too low for any meaningful analysis on the practitioner side of this survey, but we were able to get a lot of fruitful analysis from the survey, or from the survivor survey. And so these kind of stats that we'll run through are all about the survivors. And so, yeah, again, we have a lot of racial diversity among the survivors who participated in the survey. And then next slide. And yeah, as we can see also, most respondents were women, and 16 identified as transgender. And even though most respondents identified as heterosexual and straight, the vast majority also identified under the LGBTQIA umbrella. And so this really, again, was just an added diversity in our sample, and really kind of getting at the diversity of survivors. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Also, the average age was 34, and survivors ranged from 20 to 58. About 22% had a disability, and 84 were U.S. citizens. And most had a high school diploma or college education, and many of them were employed either full-time or part-time. And also, we had a lot of diversity in the actual regions that they were in and the types of areas. And so we had a pretty good distribution between urban, suburban, and rural geographies in our sample. So now we can dive into some of the key findings. And so the first one we're going to start with are the definitions of justice and accountability that survivors and practitioners had. So survivors most often define justice using words such as accountability, such as kind of consequences or restitution or karma, and fairness. And so this was kind of focused on like getting the truth out, really addressing equity and equality. And it was also really closely tied to their safety and recovery. And so this could mean separation or protection from their partner, prevention of future harm, or just having stability for their future. And over 50% of survivors define justice through the legal system. And so this means kind of going through the court process, filing charges, having fair representation. But others saw it as kind of an acknowledgement and an effort to change their partner, or kind of have a general awareness in the community about the harm that had happened and ways forward. And about 5 survivors said that justice is different for each person, which varies very drastically from how practitioners kind of defined it, with about 54% of practitioners saying that justice is different for each person. And then also a small share of practitioners and survivors said that there is no justice, or that they don't think justice is available under the current systems that we have. And so one quote that I just wanted to elevate that kind of encompasses how justice and healing is defined for survivors is from one survivor who said, "Justice is my healing process. That's more important to me than justice being served on a legal level. But when I think of the word, it means both. But I'm more focused on my internal healing." Next slide, please. Okay. So survivors also had a lot of different preferred responses to their partners, and a lot of survivors said that they wanted mental health services available for their ex-partner, or possibly their current partner as well. They also wanted mental health services for themselves, and then also wanted social services in order for them to help achieve employment or find affordable housing. And then a smaller share of our survey respondents said that payment to them, as in restitution, the incarceration of their partner, or social services for their partner were really important to them and felt like a just response. Okay, next slide. Okay. And so, yeah, this is kind of getting at how survivors wanted to be able to get justice or accountability. And this quote here, "It takes a village," really encompasses what we saw in the data, because the vast majority of people really acknowledge that it should be many people who help them achieve justice or accountability. And so this can range from family and friends to community members, people in the legal system, or just anyone outside of the legal system generally. And so though many acknowledge that it should be law enforcement and different aspects of the legal system to help them achieve justice or accountability, they often felt like this wasn't the reality. And so that was also why so many additional people were mentioned. And there are also a lot of nuances with the involvement of family, with some survivors kind of wanting family to be engaged in some aspects of justice or accountability and not to be engaged in others. And there was an immense value of advocates, therapists, and lawyers who were able to help them get justice or accountability. And so I'll pass it back to Orchid to see if there is anything surprising about these definitions, anything that you would generally expect from what we see now.
The definitions, I don't have any points to add about the definitions. The one thing I'll say about this particular slide about, who's best able to help get justice or accountability, the thing that stood out to me is the difference, the significant difference between what shows up under friends and family and what shows up under community members. And my takeaway from that is on the practitioner side, I think that there is especially when you become really frustrated with systems responses, there is a slippery slope where you start to over-romanticize community and have this view of somehow this community that has yet to exist in our world. And survivors know that, it seems. And so the difference between like trusted friends and family, that type of engagement, and like general, let's bring in the community, is very different. So I think that applies, that, I think that shows up in any of our, whatever we want to plan or orchestrate or invite people into. I think that distinction is important.
Yeah, thank you so much for elevating that. I think that's a really important point for us to hold. And so, yeah, we can move on to the next of the key findings, which is the criminal and civil legal system. Okay. So for survivors, protective orders were the most frequent interaction that they had with the civil legal system. And then this was followed by divorce and custody cases. But as we can see, most survivors were actively avoidant of the criminal legal system more so than the civil legal. And while some survivors were grateful for the police and the interactions that they had with law enforcement, others say that it didn't really help with the resolution. And some say that even when they called to find safety, that was the only thing they were looking for, but they didn't want their partner to become involved in the criminal legal system further. But as we know, that's something that's very hard to control. And in the criminal legal system, most survivors did not get past the initial police reporting stage. And of those who did continue past it, the majority ended up having little communication with the prosecutor and had a really hard time getting their questions answered by different folks in the criminal legal system. We can go to the next slide. Okay. And overall, there were a lot of mixed perceptions with the legal system. A lot of people will have positive experiences with the police and other kind of legal actors, but then many others did not find it helpful. And there were also, again, mixed perceptions of whether the legal system resulted in safety or justice for them, because, again, many people felt unheard or felt like they lacked agency in both systems. And there was a strong consensus that both systems were more accessible for some groups than others. Most survivors highlighted that, some groups have less access to the legal system, including those who are low income and really can't afford to take off of work to be showing up to different court dates or to pay the legal fees. Those who are racial or ethnically marginalized, those with disabilities, those who are LGBTQ, and those with limited English proficiency, especially around the language access and feeling like they can fully participate in court and just be fully aware of what's going on. Okay. We can go to the next slide. Okay. And then finally, we kind of delved into what worked and what didn't work in the legal system for survivors and what practitioners identified as what works and what doesn't. And so survivors identified that advocacy and direct service support, support from families and friends, and lawyers and legal help were really important in helping it be easier for them to participate in the legal system. And similarly, practitioners identified advocacy support, legal help, and counsel. But here they also identified that a positive law enforcement response would also really help survivors participate in the system and kind of feel like that is a more trusted avenue for them to get support in. But then there were also several barriers that survivors face while they engage with the legal system. And so primarily that fear and distrust of system actors, especially for those survivors of color, those who are LGBTQ, et cetera. The burden of the process, again, just having the time and the money to be able to go through it, or feeling like there is an adequate support system, and then the inaccessibility with money and language. And then practitioners also identified a fear of retaliation or harm, the economic barriers and challenges, and then the fear of law enforcement as well. And so with that, I will pass it to Marina to talk about alternative approaches to justice.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Orchid, for your insightful comments and helping us guide the study and guide us as we were looking at these findings and co-interpreting them together really with you and other partners. You know, I before we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to pause and also reflect that in the graph where Claudia was showing that many practitioners, over 50%, said that justice looks different for people. And then few survivors said that that's not surprising to me, because I think, if anything, that's a testament to practitioners recognizing that justice should not be how they define it. It's survivors and the practitioners who work with them, the incredible people in the legal system, in the advocate, in the community organizations, all of them, lots of them recognize that that's the case. And I don't want to be an annoying researcher in front of you saying our findings are mixed, but they are, because we've seen that what works for some folks, like Claudia said, we were surprised that many survivors actually shared that they had good interactions with police officers who were men and women. We had an equal share of survivors who said it didn't work. And so, of course, we work in this field and we know that sometimes the legal system or the formal systems may fail people. So we were very interested in exploring what alternatives survivors looked at and how they felt, whether they felt that they were helpful or not. And I just want to say that in our protocol, we gave examples to survivors starting from formal systems like programs where you bring in mediated group, and all the way to go into religious institution, go into therapy, getting some money. So we really explored the range. And we can go to the next slide, Mallory. Okay. So the first thing is, when we asked both practitioners and survivors about availability of programs or approaches, not surprisingly, not that many people knew about something formalized in their community. So this is still a new field. Other survivors have participated in some form of it, but we saw some hesitation in alternative programs. One is survivors did not want to interact with their partner, or I would say here there was lack of hope from survivors that we heard that their partner really can change their mind, that their voices, survivors' wishes would be centered. Also, survivors said that they'd rather prioritize their mental health and basic needs and go on their way. Plenty of survivors we spoke with, where they were already separated from their partner. I mentioned the disbelief that the partner would engage. And then also for several survivors that we talked to in immigrant communities, in LGBTQ, we still heard that there is shame related to involving families and greater community. And then survivors most often found a sense of healing from therapists and advocates, and as Claudia mentioned earlier, from friends and family. I'm going to pause here and invite Orchid again. Orchid, we worked with you. I know you've attempted instituting or running a program that involves larger families, but just wanted you to reflect both on the alternatives and share some perspectives that you might have, and also if you have any thoughts on traditional systems based on your rich experience of working in the field.
Oh my goodness. I think that the material that is on this slide resonates a lot with me and what I've heard in past efforts. Um, Honestly, I think that the low familiarity with restorative justice practices or alternative programs, that I know we're looking at survivor perceptions, I think that perception actually runs across all involved people. Systems people, community advocates, people who specifically do. I feel like the, excuse me, the populations who are familiar are very specific at this point. I think what I have seen is that participation in alternative approaches has depended a lot on the type of violence and the type of, it's like the type of violence and the type of person who's using violence. And then also in the life after violence, do you have to share a lot of space, community space, because there's no other option? Do you have to function together in co-parenting because there's no other option? Do you have the opportunity to actually live a totally separate life and just literally just completely move on? Are you, is this something that happened a long time in the past and you're trying to achieve some sort of resolution now when there's no ongoing threat? Or is this a situation where you're staying and you want engagement from close family to try to make things safer where you are now? You're not leaving. Each of those scenarios means a totally different, set of goals for the survivor, sense of who could be involved, sense of what kind of action you want to take. So, and I think with this survivor group, this disbelief that their partner would engage in a program or change their behavior, most of the survivors that are participating in these interviews are people who have had interface with the program, who understand something about community-based organizations, advocacy, what a victim advocate or a survivor advocate or court advocate, like they have some knowledge of that. And they have tried everything. I would say like 0.0% of people have one negative experience and are like, never mind, I'm going to quit you and try something new. They've tried everything. So by the time they get to this interview, they're definitely in that disbelief. Like, believe you me, I tried everything. Like, you think your new way is going to work? I think it won't. But for some other people, if we're talking to them way earlier in their process, then I think you could get a different response. When people are at a stage of relationship where they are still, the hope side is very high, it could be different. But I think overall, not wanting to interact with partner is high across all of the scenarios that I described. Or if you don't have to engage with them ever again, that like one-time confrontation where they're not allowed to talk, people have been interested in. But that's not interacting. That's just speaking to. And yeah, I think that most important is the bottom one, the feelings of shame related to involving families or greater community members. The other thing I've seen is just a lot of hope about bringing in your closest people, but then the reality is that the process, the friend has to, oops, what happened here? The friend has
We can still hear you, okay.
Okay, good. I was like, has it been disabled? The stamina that engagement asks of the close friends and family members has sometimes turned out to be stamina that they don't have. And so then the fear that those people are now against me because now they think, I trusted you before, but now I think you are kind of the problem. They don't understand that it's that the trauma and the impacts of trauma are the problem. They just think it's the survivor. And I think that's hard. And support of the friends and family to get more understanding is a huge way we can support the survivors.
And Orchid, you said something that also we heard across all the sites and different groups of survivors we talked to, in that before survivor makes that first step into the justice system or decides to call the police, they don't know what rights or what is waiting for them. And we will say that sometimes if they have an advocate who asks them and sets the expectations, but in some cases they don't. So we just want to emphasize the importance of people, especially upfront in the formal system, to walk survivors through different options and to set expectations that the person just doesn't feel frustrated about it. And there were a couple of others, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Mallory to move on, but I will invite you, Orchid, again on a few more points.
Thank you for that, adding that point, because it is huge.
Yep. We can skip here, other than if you look at these three categories of what this is from survey, not through the interviews, but three top categories what survivors were most interested in. They said therapy, counseling, and healing practices for me and potentially a partner. Economic supports, we really cannot say enough in this. You all know this. Our report will reflect this, but really a financial liberty for survivors to make the decisions that are best for them is important. And then potential payments for harm, not just victims of crime compensation, but really everything that the survivor has been through. And Mallory, we can go to the next slide. We are going to skip this one because, again, in the interest of time, but we will share these slides with those of you who register, as Susan said in the chat, and you can dive in. And also, I want to say that we are planning a lot of products. They will be available on our urban.org website. Some of them will be long, some of them will be short. So we ask you to use them, to get back to us about them, and we are happy to engage more. But Mallory, let's go to the next one. Again, I think Orchid hit on these. Let's get to the some unmet needs, which I think are important. Okay, we also ask survivors often about their unmet needs or what they were looking for. And I like this slide, and I want to pause here. We ask survivors in the beginning and in the end of each interview, did you get justice or feel harms were repaired? And I don't want this slide to be a discouragement to you, but I do think, to me, this is motivating that we have a long road ahead. That 57% of them said, no, I don't feel I got justice. And that goes back to the point I tried to make earlier about potentially thinking about setting expectations and working with survivors of what they can really get out of the legal system or other approaches or not. And then 36% said, yeah, maybe, but there was qualification, and you can see some quotes on the left here, and very few had a very definite answer of yes, I did. And again, justice is a lofty term. I remember with some interpreters, I don't come from this country. It's very hard to even translate that word. So we recognize that maybe just the question itself is loaded. But I think this is an important slide to me. Mallory, we can move to next one, please. Greatest unmet needs. Of course, survivors through different incredible providers and shelter organizations that we worked with found some temporary housing, but we generally saw a lot that there was desire for direct cash transfers, or like experiments where they could use funds and they could find ways to find safety in whatever shape or form they found meaning in. Also, some survivors, and Orchid kind of made this point, some survivors wanted an apology from the person who harmed them, but whether they would get it or not, that remained as a question. Also, a sense of resolution to their case or situation. Some survivors said, I'm still in the process of the court, and I just didn't get a sense yet of where this will end up. And we just wanted to reflect it. And I also want to share that a lot of our findings are in the point in time, and it depends on whether you start in the process when you have hopes that justice will be done versus once you went through the civil protection order and something else, and the relationship is still complicated and you have kids in common. So again, finding resolution is a difficult subject, and many survivors share that with us. Lots of survivors said, okay, I met some of my basic needs, but I haven't yet healed. I don't know how to take the time, and I'm getting to that process. So the ability to address their trauma is still an unmet need that we heard. And then also, our study was specifically engaging survivors through trusted partners from communities that experience adversity. And there is lack of culturally specific programs. There is lack of interpretation sometimes. There is lack of awareness of how to work with LGBTQ couples and understand the dynamics of primary aggressor and a survivor. So we still have room to go there. And I think with this, I'm going to turn it over to okay, there was what made the biggest difference. I'm not going to turn it over, but I do want to invite Orchid. Orchid, you speak so well because you work with the population, and just wanted to for you to reflect on not even just through the study, but some of the unmet needs and what do you think about where we have to go, and how do you reflect on what I just shared about survivors' needs?
Yeah, I mean, these these are really, to me, the central things. I think people need the community of support. Any of us in this situation, we need the community of support, and we need the safe housing to be able to actually successfully get away from the violence that's happening now. And we need the independence and the financial support so that it can, one, help our healing now, but two, make sure that we're not economically pushed into the next abusive situation, where we're leaving somebody incurs a giant financial risk and threat on our lives or our kids' lives. So, and I think the community of support, one of the things that we really advocate for is just like this list, it's like everyone. So someone having a therapist is amazing if they have that resource. It's not enough. That peer counselor who understands some more of their background or their community, the peer counselor who can actually check in with them a lot is a huge part of who can help make a tiny piece of normalcy come back. Just like basically a friend, until you're in a state where you can build new friends, like real friends, not like a peer counselor at a community-based organization. But I think that role that we sometimes play is the most important role, which is friend. Like, you can't make it through this without friends, and most survivors by the time they're at this point have lost their friends. So sometimes you're the victim service provider and advocate in the role of both advocate and friend until that third bullet point gets built up more, where there actually are supportive friends and family. So I feel like it's very basic humanity. This is how human beings survive.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I do want to add that, and Claudia, I think, made this point. Survivors do want to involve their friends and families, but we need to let them decide when and where. And then what we heard that in some courts still across this country, a prosecutor that is very well-meaning has to write many forms to let survivors bring their family and friends into court hearing. It's a public place, anybody can come, but we all know that obstacles still exist. Sometimes they are safety is mentioned for everybody attending, but if we know that family and friends matter, then I think we need to remove the obstacles in the courtrooms if that's what survivor wishes. If survivor says, no, I'd rather come alone and we don't ask them why, then they come alone and we support them in that way. So it really depends again, but we are trying to capture the variety of these voices, hopefully. And I wanted to turn it over to Mallory to walk us through some of the implications and then questions after that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marina and Claudia and Orchid, for all of these wonderful insights and just summarizing in general the incredibly rich information that we learned from all of these survivors and the practitioners who are working with them as well. So our goal, and I hope you all can agree that we accomplished this, was to highlight the wide diversity of survivors' backgrounds and experiences, while also identifying, some of the shared needs and perspectives regarding justice, accountability, healing, and really understanding that justice, accountability, healing, safety are all incredibly tied together in the minds of survivors. We can't, I think we've been coming back to this idea of, this is a study about justice, but what came up over and over again was it's also a study about safety. It's also a study about community. It's also a study about healing and the long journey that entails. So, again, one of the key recurring themes that we saw over and over again was that it takes a village to achieve justice and accountability in domestic violence cases. That, service providers have as much impact on accountability as the legal system, and the legal system has just as much impact on helping survivors heal when done correctly and when done well. And then, less traditional stakeholders also play an important role, including, as you saw, health and mental health providers, religious institutions, employers, other community groups. So given that, we really hope that these findings can prompt stakeholders across all the different sectors to think about how they're meeting the needs of all survivors, and how they're contributing to survivors' sense of justice, knowing that it's such a broad term and looks so different for each person. So we hope that this is, of course, should be top of mind for legal system professionals, whether that's in law enforcement, prosecution offices, or courts. We hope we've kind of made the case that alternative justice models have a lot of promise, but there's also a lot of questions there, and there's clear research gaps, as well as making sure that they need to address these very unique, nuanced cases of domestic violence. Of course, victim service providers are essential to this work, and have a clear role in helping survivors understand what justice means to them, think through some of those thorny issues, and help them navigate their different options and systems. And then, of course, we think that this, we can't really improve responses to survivors overall if policymakers and federal agencies aren't on board as well and doing what they can to reduce some of those barriers and provide some of the guidance and funding necessary to do some of this big, important work. So in that vein, we identified a number of specifically, hopefully actionable recommendations. Let me just put them all up here. Some of which span all sectors and others for specific sectors. So many of these stem directly from participants' desire for empowerment, choice, and for for practitioners to take all forms of domestic violence seriously and really understand how domestic violence appears in different communities and for different relationships. Our recommendations are also designed to address some of the pervasive barriers that we heard to justice, such as lack of awareness of options among both survivors and practitioners, language inaccessibility, and lack of culturally informed and appropriate services. Specifically, survivors want practitioners to be open-minded about non-traditional power dynamics, how abuse and trauma appears in different communities. And then, this last recommendation up there is a little self-serving, but we identified 9 guiding principles for justice responses based on the study and the stakeholder roundtable, and we hope that those can be a tool of support help communities change across the board. And once I stop sharing my screen, or one of my colleagues can put the link to the brief that outlines the guiding principles specifically in the chat. Okay, I can go on. And then, given how many service providers we have here with us today, we wanted to share some of the recommendations we identified specifically for this group. Again, these roles are so important, given how often we heard from survivors that advocacy support was what made the difference in survivors' journey towards justice and in helping them navigate the system. Our main recommendation is really to incorporate justice and accountability topics in case management, advocacy, and other direct services, and continue having those conversations as survivors' needs and preferences evolved. I think Orchid and Marina made that point really eloquently, that these perceptions are not static and can look really different depending on where survivors are in their journeys. And then we also recommend that service providers participate in training and educating themselves on the justice system or legal system and restorative justice options and processes, so they can help survivors with those incredibly complicated decisions and systems. And then generally, we invite providers to assess their own services for any barriers that might exist for survivors with certain identities. I don't necessarily need to go into these in super detail in the interest of time and wanting to get to your questions, but we really want to share that we identified recommendations, again, for legal system practitioners and practitioners involved in alternative justice programs, and just highlighting that, a couple of these, specifically suggestions around communication can include clarity around the process and their options early on. Developing skills in empathetic listening was raised by several survivors we talked to, tailoring communication methods to survivors' preferences and keeping them better informed of decisions. And then that agency-specific reviews really should focus on to what extent they're implementing trauma-informed practices and what barriers remain, so that survivors aren't re-victimized by the process, and then reducing some of these barriers and challenges of participating. And then with restorative justice, again, really, this shouldn't be surprising given what we've talked about already, but making sure that these programs are actually able to be responsive to the needs of domestic violence survivors specifically, that they're safe, that they are protecting survivors and their needs around interacting with their partner, and that, acknowledging that we need more research on how effective they are and how they're being implemented with this population specifically. So again, lots more recommendations are included in our final research report, which will be coming out next month, as well as a number of other products and a lot more findings. So the guiding principles brief is already available. Our final research report, as well as a brief specifically on survivors and practitioners' perspectives and how that they align, a fact sheet highlighting survivors' resiliency, and then eventually a scholarly journal article as well. So lots of ways to learn about all of this research. Then we hope you'll check out all of that, because we think this is such an important study that fills such an important gap in understanding how what survivors need and how we can help address those. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and pause for questions or comments. And I think I'm going to need somebody else to maybe I can go ahead and put this up briefly and then stop sharing my screen, maybe, so I can I can see the chat.
Thanks, folks. Go ahead and enter your questions in chat. I've also posted the link to the feedback survey, just so that you have it there. One question did come in during the presentation, and that was and this was back toward the beginning of the presentation, when defining justice, were survivors allowed to select multiple responses or just one?
So I can go ahead and say that when survivors were defining justice, they were able that was primarily in the interviews, and they were able to define it in their own words, and kind of talk through what those concepts meant. And then the graph that we had on the screen was really kind of our categorizing of their very diverse responses into some of these themes. But really we and you'll see when you check out the report, but we really wanted to be able to highlight their own words and their own perceptions, and a lot of them had really nuanced definitions of how they conceive justice that contained a lot of different themes, a lot of different ideas, and yeah, it was clear that they really appreciated the opportunity to be able to talk through those concepts, like with us in their own words.
Thanks. And you see, we got another request for you to either reshare the slide with the emails, or you could drop the emails into chat. And folks, just go ahead and enter any other questions you have. I know our presenters have covered a lot, and I am looking forward to looking for the guiding principles. They mentioned some other reports and products that will come out. We will be saving the list of those of you who registered for this event and make sure to let you know when those products are available. All right, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous. Are you planning to do a journal article? I noticed quickly you talked about some other reports that are out. Is a journal article coming?
Yes, we are drafting a journal article that will be specifically focused on how certain aspects of people's experiences predict their definitions of justice. So how justice definitions and their experience of justice, whether they got it or not, is predicted by their engagement with different systems or certain aspects of their identity.
Great. And there was a request for you to present at the VOCA conference, and another question about whether you're planning to present your findings anywhere else.
We are thinking of different avenues. We've already presented at researcher conference. We're thinking of some practitioner conferences. And also, I just want to say that while we have a journal article, our full technical report, we are writing it in an accessible way, but it is still geared. We're trying to balance. We are researchers slash consultants slash survivors. So we are trying to reach different audiences. So I wouldn't just gravitate towards our journal article only, but look at the full report, which will be available on urban.org. I shared in the chat the link to the brief that Mallory mentioned on guiding principles, but there will be a full report that will capture much more nuance. And then there will be something even more, like Mallory said, geared really towards researchers in the journal article. And then survivors' voices. We are trying to reach a variety of audiences, and we would love for you to reach out to us. I put in our contact information to present with you, to collaborate in many different ways, and just also use our products however you see fit and give us feedback on how it goes.
Great. We got a request about whether the recording for today's presentation will be shareable. We will be lightly editing the recording and posting it on CVR's YouTube channel. As soon as that happens, we will let all of you know that it's available. All right.
I guess in response to the question about whether we're presenting anywhere else, actually, we just found out today that we'll be presenting on this at the Stockholm Criminology Symposium, I think is what it's. So if anybody's going abroad to that conference, feel free to come check us out.
That's right. We'll just get a busload of us all to go to Sweden to support you there.
And swim there. Yeah, I was going to.
Another question has come in. You mentioned that feedback can change depending on the time in the process or how much they've seen of the legal system already. Is there a way to look at those data by the number of lifetime victimizations or the time involved in the criminal legal system? Or what about sample size?
I will take it because I alluded to that, and team, please chime in. Our study didn't look through the trajectory of changes of use because our initial desire here was really to elevate the voices of survivors who we traditionally don't hear from. Like Orchid said, we worked with partners who have already the trust of survivors who identify as LGBTQ, as immigrant and internationals, with the help of interpreters where needed, rural South, and also Native American community, although we do point out that our sample size for the interviews was smaller for Native American communities. I think one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, is that looking at this change is important. However, it is very difficult. You saw that even in the survey, it is. I just want to acknowledge the limitation there. Capturing survivors' voices through these systems is practically very difficult to organize this research. But if some of you are out there thinking about that, or if you are a practice organization that thinks you can help, please reach out to us and we will do that. We will partner with you because it is important to see how it shifts.
All right, I've dropped another link to the feedback survey in chat, and it looks like that's it for today's questions. I want to thank you, presenters. This has been really fascinating. And as you can see, there's a lot of interest. We'll share again, the edited recording. And if you take that feedback survey, you can request a copy of the slides, or if you need it, a certificate of participation. So with that, I'll end today's session. Thanks very much. And thanks also for our ASL interpreter. He's been doing a fabulous job. Okay, goodbye, everybody.